good enough for anyone, she sneered at the family dinner 3 years later. He's living in my childhood bedroom. When my husband walked in, her face turned pale. Hello everyone. Thank you for being here with me today. Before I begin my story, I'd love to know which city you're joining us from. Please feel free to share in the comments. Now, let me take you into this story. My name is Meredith Moore. I'm 32 years old, an interior architect living up here in the misty, beautiful city of Seattle. And 3 years ago, my entire world, everything I had built and believed in, shattered in a single evening. It shattered because my sister, my own flesh and blood, stole the man I was supposed to marry. It's funny, the things that stick with you after a trauma. It's not always the big, loud moments. For me, it was the smells of that night. I can conjure them right now, as clearly as if I were standing there again. The first thing I remember is the sharp, clean scent of lavender from my mother's meticulously kept garden, its fragrance growing stronger as the twilight air began to cool. Then there was the sweet, smoky aroma of grilled peaches she was preparing for dessert, a smell that should have meant comfort and home. And finally, the rich, earthy scent of a good Cabernet Sauvignon breathing on the sideboard in my parents' dining room. This was supposed to be the beginning of everything. It was the eve of my engagement party. My parents' sprawling, comfortable home in Eugene, Oregon, a place filled with all the happy and complicated ghosts of my childhood, was glowing. String lights were draped from the old oak trees, casting a warm, magical light over the backyard. The low, happy hum of family chatter was a constant, comforting buzz in the background. I remember feeling like I was floating, not just walking, through the gentle chaos. A sense of something almost sacred had settled over me. It was my moment. Our moment. Keith and I had been together for 4 steady, thoughtful years. He wasn't the stuff of whirlwind romances or passionate, fiery novels. He was better than that, he was real. He was the calm after a storm I didn't even know I was in until he arrived. He was the kind of man who remembered that I took my coffee with a splash of cream and a half teaspoon of sugar, who would instinctively reach for my hand during the scary parts of movies, who didn't just hear the words I said but actually listened to them. He was kind, measured, and gentle, in a way that had slowly, methodically dismantled all the walls I'd built around my heart. He made me believe, truly and deeply, that I was safe with him. We weren't just dating, we were building a life. We had blueprints, both literal and figurative. We'd spent hours poring over designs for the small house we planned to build just outside the city. We'd had the big talks, the important ones, where we'd live, how many kids we wanted, whose turn it was to handle the tedious stuff like finances and planning for a college fund. We were supposed to be a team. And then came the fracture. The clean, sickening break. I'd stepped inside the house to grab a shawl from my old bedroom. My dress, a pale green silk that Keith loved, wasn't quite warm enough for the evening chill that was starting to creep in from the coast. The hallway was dim, lit only by the fading sun filtering through the high windows, casting long, somber shadows on the floor. The house had fallen into that soft, temporary lull that comes just before sunset, when the day seems to hold its breath before surrendering to the night. That's when I heard them. 2 voices. They were low, intimate, too close to be casual. And then, a laugh. It was a breathless, familiar sound that made my stomach twist so violently it almost buckled my knees. I knew that laugh. It was Brenda's. I turned toward the den, my bare feet silent on the cool hardwood floor. A strange, cold sense of dread washed over me, a physical sensation that started in my gut and spread through my veins. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that my pre-wedding nerves were getting the better of me. It was just my sister, talking to my fiancé. Nothing more. But it wasn't just talking. There they were, framed in the wide doorway of the den like a perfectly composed portrait of betrayal. My fiancé, Keith. My younger sister, Brenda. His hand was resting on the small of her back, his thumb drawing slow, deliberate circles on the fabric of her dress. Her fingers were tangled in the dark hair at the back of his neck, her nails lightly scratching, pulling him just slightly closer. They were whispering something I couldn't hear, but their faces were just inches apart, their breath mingling in the small, charged space between them. There was an energy in that space, an intimacy so potent, so familiar from my own moments with him, that it sucked all the air right out of my lungs. They didn't notice me at first. For a few seconds that stretched into a painful, suffocating eternity, I was invisible. I just stood there, my body frozen, my mind screaming. I watched them lean into each other like I didn't exist, like the last 4 years of my life with him hadn't happened. Like I wasn't the one who was supposed to be wearing his ring, building his future, bearing his children. Like I hadn't trusted them both with every single fragile part of me. When they finally saw me, when Keith's eyes lifted over Brenda's shoulder and met mine, neither of them said a word. His face, the face I loved, twisted into something ugly, a mask of pathetic guilt and raw dread. Brenda, on the other hand, just blinked. She looked at me, her expression flat, almost bored, as if I were a minor inconvenience she'd have to deal with. The room was utterly, horribly still. There was no yelling, no frantic, whispered apologies, no desperate explanations. There was just a heavy, suffocating silence, the distant sound of my uncle laughing in the garden, and the quiet, internal sound of something inside me collapsing into dust. That was the night everything changed. If you had asked me then, standing on that porch with my hand trembling so hard I had to clench it into a fist, a garden full of laughing, oblivious guests behind me, if I believed I'd ever feel whole again, I would have said no. Absolutely, unequivocally not. But here I am. 3 years later. And when I walked into that family dinner with the man I actually married and saw Brenda freeze, her face turning pale at the sight of him, that's when I knew. Some things don't need to be said out loud to be heard. A week before that party, life had felt almost cinematic. It was early summer in Oregon, the kind of perfect, sun-drenched weather that makes you believe only good things can happen. I had flown down from Seattle to my parents' house in Eugene, feeling giddy and excited. I loved that house. It was the backdrop to my entire life, a place I knew like the back of my hand, the specific creak of the third step on the main staircase, the tangled mess of ivy curling along the gutters, the comforting sound of my mother humming an old tune in the kitchen as she cooked. It all wrapped around me like an old, worn quilt. Our family life wasn't a fairy tale, we had our share of arguments and slammed doors, usually revolving around Brenda, but it was familiar. It was warm. It was home. Brenda was already there, of course. She always managed to arrive early, whether she was invited or not, and immediately insert herself into the center of everything. That was my sister. My younger sister by 2 years, the one who could walk into any room and effortlessly steal all the attention. She was radiant, quick-witted, and possessed a kind of magnetic charm that drew people in, even when you actively didn't want them to. Growing up, people always said we were opposites, like night and day. I was the quiet, thoughtful one who lived in books and my own architectural sketches. She was the loud, electric one who lived for the spotlight and the admiration of others. For years, I used to think that made us balance each other out. That she was the fire and I was the earth, and together we made a whole. I don't believe that anymore. In those first few days of planning, Brenda was surprisingly helpful. It was almost disarming how much she threw herself into the preparations. She was on the phone with the florist, arguing passionately about the precise shade of peonies we needed. She was texting me endless color palettes for the table linens, her opinions strong and unyielding. She even made a special trip to a high-end liquor store across town to pick up Keith's favorite small-batch whiskey, something I hadn't even thought of yet. I remember standing in the kitchen with my mom, arranging freshly cut flowers in a large crystal vase, and I said, feeling a wave of sisterly affection, "You know, it's really nice having her here. It feels like she's actually happy for me this time." My mom, she smiled, but it was too quick. It didn't quite reach her eyes. She just wiped her hands on her floral apron and said, "Of course, honey. She's just excited for you." At the time, I wanted to believe that with all my heart. I clung to that idea, because the alternative, that this was all some kind of performance, was too painful to even consider. But looking back now, with the brutal clarity of hindsight, the moments were there. They were subtle, strange little blips in the happy family movie I was so desperately trying to direct. There was the way Brenda's hand would linger on Keith's arm just a second too long when she laughed at one of his jokes, her touch proprietary and familiar. There were the inside jokes they seemed to develop overnight, whispering in a corner and then bursting into laughter, leaving me on the outside looking in. I remember one night specifically, a few days before the party. We were all sitting around the dinner table. I was telling a story about a difficult client at my firm, and I glanced across the table at Keith for support. But he wasn't looking at me. His eyes were on Brenda. It was a quick, almost imperceptible look, but it was charged with something I couldn't name. It made the skin on my arms prickle with a cold I couldn't explain. Brenda, catching his gaze, gave him a tiny, conspiratorial smile before turning back to her food. I felt like I'd just walked in on a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. I caught it all. My mind registered every single one of those microscopic betrayals. But I swallowed them down, one by one, pushing them into a dark corner of my mind. I told myself I was being paranoid, that this was just what pre-wedding jitters felt like. I rationalized their behavior until it seemed almost normal. Brenda had always been flirtatious with everyone, it was just her personality. And Keith, who was usually a bit reserved, was just getting comfortable with my family, finally feeling like one of us. That's what love is, I reasoned with myself late at night, staring at the ceiling. It's about trusting. Trusting even when your gut is screaming at you, begging you not to. I made a conscious choice to trust them. That was my greatest mistake. The night of the party arrived in a whirlwind of last-minute preparations and a buzzing, nervous energy. Friends and relatives, people I'd known my whole life, started pouring into our backyard. Their laughter echoed under the sprawling branches of the apple trees my dad had planted when I was born. Music was playing from a sleek Bluetooth speaker that Brenda, of course, had insisted we use, dismissing my dad's old stereo system as ancient. I wore that pale green silk dress, the one Keith once said brought out the color of my eyes. He looked handsome in a crisp blue shirt, but I could see he was a little nervous, which I found endearing. It made me feel like this whole thing, this public declaration of our future, meant something real to him. And still, I couldn't shake the feeling. It was a knot of anxiety that had been tightening in my stomach all day, a quiet but persistent hum of wrongness just beneath the surface of all the celebration. Midway through the evening, I was inside, helping my mom arrange some extra dessert plates on the kitchen counter. We were laughing about something my goofy Uncle Rob had said, and for a fleeting moment, the knot in my stomach loosened. I felt happy. Then I realized I'd left my shawl on the rocking chair in my old bedroom. The Oregon night air had turned, and the temperature had dropped just enough to raise goosebumps on my arms. "I'll be right back," I told my mom, ducking out of the bustling kitchen and heading into the quiet, dimly lit hallway. That's when I heard them. The low voices. A soft murmur, and then a breathy, intimate laugh. Brenda's laugh. I knew that laugh better than my own. My feet seemed to move of their own accord, carrying me toward the den, the cozy family room where we kept the old upright piano and my dad's vast collection of history books. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. And there it was. Them. Keith was standing far too close to her, his body angled in a way that was protective, possessive, shutting out the rest of the world. Brenda's hands were in his hair, her fingers gently stroking the back of his neck as their bodies leaned in, drawn together like two powerful magnets. Time didn't slow down. It stopped. My feet were rooted to the floorboards. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even draw a proper breath. I was watching something I had no language for. It was a private world, a secret universe, unfolding right in front of me, a universe I was never meant to witness. They didn't see me right away. And in those few seconds of unwilling invisibility, I felt everything crash down on me with the force of a physical blow. Every lie I'd been told, every dismissed suspicion, every silent warning my gut had screamed at me, it all fell into place like the pieces of a cruel, perfect puzzle. My own paranoia hadn't been paranoia at all. It had been instinct. And I had ignored it. When Keith finally turned his head, his smile fading as he saw me standing in the shadows of the hallway, his face twisted into something ugly. It was a mask of pathetic guilt and raw, animal dread. Brenda just blinked. She looked at me, her expression flat, almost bored, as if I were a fly buzzing annoyingly in her ear. There was no gasp of shock, no stammered, tearful apology. There was only a cold, hard, damning silence. I backed away slowly. My footsteps didn't make a sound. It felt like even the old floorboards of my childhood home pitted me too much to make a noise. Outside, the party continued, oblivious. I could hear the cheerful laughter, the upbeat music, the clinking of champagne flutes in a toast. No one knew. No one in that entire backyard knew that I had just lost my entire future in the space of a single, silent heartbeat. I didn't stay for goodbyes. I didn't stay to watch them cut the cake my mother had so lovingly baked. Sometime in the deep, dark hours before dawn, while the house was finally silent and everyone was asleep, I packed my things. I moved like a ghost through the familiar rooms, my movements numb and robotic. I wrote a short, stark note on a napkin and left it on the kitchen counter. It simply read, "I need time." Then I slipped out the back door into the gray, misty morning without waking a single soul. The drive back to Seattle was a 5-hour blur of asphalt and tears. I didn't turn on the radio. The silence was a heavy blanket. When I finally walked into my apartment, the place that had been my sanctuary, it looked different. It was the same space, same furniture, same stunning view of the city skyline, but it felt smaller somehow. Colder. Lonelier. The walls seemed to echo with a profound emptiness. The first thing I did, before I even took off my coat, was take down the engagement photos. We had one framed on the mantelpiece, a professionally shot image of us laughing in a park, looking so blissfully, naively happy. I couldn't stand seeing our smiling faces. I ripped the photo from its frame, stuffed it and all the others into an old shoebox, taped it shut with ferocious energy, and buried it under a pile of winter coats in the back of my closet. Out of sight, but never truly out of mind. Then came the digital purge, a modern-day exorcism. I sat on my couch for hours, my fingers methodically tapping on my phone and laptop. I deleted every saved message, every photo, every digital trace of him, of them, of us. I blocked Keith's number. I blocked Brenda's number. I muted their names wherever they appeared on social media, a futile attempt to erase them from my world. But there were things I couldn't delete so easily. The smell of his shampoo still lingered on a gray college sweatshirt he'd left draped over my desk chair. The sound of Brenda's breathless laugh now echoed in my memory, sharper and more painful than broken glass. I threw myself into a self-imposed isolation. I didn't tell anyone the truth. Not my concerned coworkers, who just assumed the wedding was postponed and gave me sympathetic, pitying looks. Not my friends, who left worried voicemails that I never returned. I didn't want the pity. I didn't want the endless questions and the well-meaning but useless advice. I just wanted to be left alone in my misery. My work became my only refuge. I poured every single ounce of my shattered energy into my job at the prestigious architecture firm I worked for. Long days bled into late nights. I was redrafting renderings that no one had asked for, meticulously organizing digital files that were already perfectly organized, volunteering for the most tedious, time-consuming projects just to fill the gaping hours. Exhaustion became my shield, my drug of choice. I figured if I was tired enough, I wouldn't have to think. If my body ached enough, maybe, just maybe, I wouldn't feel the relentless ache in my chest. For a few weeks, it worked. I was a machine, functioning on caffeine and grief. I'd go to work, come home, eat a bowl of cereal for dinner while staring blankly at the wall, and then pass out from sheer exhaustion. One night, in a fleeting moment of wanting to feel normal again, I tried to cook an actual meal. I put a frozen lasagna in the oven and then sat on the couch, intending to read a book. Instead, I just stared at the blank TV screen, my mind a static-filled void. I forgot about the lasagna completely until the shrill, piercing screech of the smoke alarm jolted me back to reality. The kitchen was filled with thick, acrid smoke. The lasagna was a blackened, inedible brick. I just stood there in the smoky kitchen, the alarm blaring around me, and I cried. I cried for the burnt dinner, for the woman I used to be, the one who planned parties and cooked meals and actually believed in happy endings. Weeks bled into months. The seasons changed outside my window, the vibrant greens of summer faded into the golden hues of autumn, but inside my apartment, it was always a cold, bleak winter. Then, one Friday night, nearly 6 months after my world had fallen apart, an email popped up in my inbox. It was an invitation to a gallery opening downtown. A local artist I vaguely remembered from an old college connection was having his first solo show. My first, immediate instinct was to delete it. The thought of being in a crowded room, of having to plaster a fake smile on my face and make meaningless small talk, was physically exhausting. But as my finger hovered over the delete button, something inside me, a stubborn little flicker of pride I thought had been extinguished, refused to let my life shrink any smaller than it already had. So, with a deep sigh, I pushed myself off the couch, put on a simple black dress, and forced myself out the door. That's where I saw him again. Arthur Carter. He was taller than I remembered from the few times I'd seen him in the past. There was a quiet, solid elegance in the way he stood, his hands tucked into his pockets, his shoulders relaxed, as if nothing in the world could possibly rattle him. He had been at my ill-fated engagement party, a lifetime ago. He was an old friend of Keith's from grad school, though they had drifted apart. I remembered Brenda used to talk about him in passing, always with that strange, performative admiration she reserved for men she wanted but couldn't quite impress. She'd call him intimidatingly smart or too serious, which was Brenda speak for he didn't fall for my usual act. He recognized me before I could grab a glass of cheap wine and disappear into a shadowy corner. Meredith Moore, he said, his voice calm and even, a stark contrast to the chaotic noise of the gallery. He smiled as he stepped closer. I almost didn't believe it was you. My own smile felt awkward, rusty from disuse. Neither did I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. I felt like I was wearing the skin of someone I no longer fully recognized. It's been a long time. We talked for a while, standing near a large, chaotic abstract painting that seemed to mirror the state of my inner world. We talked about the art, about the city, about how absurdly bad the complimentary wine selection was. He made me laugh, a real, genuine laugh that felt foreign in my own throat. And in that entire conversation, he asked nothing about the past. Not a single question about Keith. Not a single mention of Brenda. He just asked what I'd been working on at my firm, what coffee shop I liked most, whether I still sketched my initial designs by hand or had fully converted to digital. He made space for me to just be a person again, not a walking tragedy. He didn't look at me with pity. He just looked at me. That night, I went home and felt lighter. It wasn't a miracle cure. The deep, familiar ache was still there, a dull throb in my chest, but for the first time in months, it wasn't the only thing I could feel. It didn't become a whirlwind romance. Thank God. My bruised and battered heart couldn't have handled a whirlwind. It became something quieter, slower, more deliberate and infinitely more precious. We ran into each other again the following week, a planned coincidence on his part at my favorite coffee shop near my office. He confessed later he'd been hoping to see me there. Then we met up at a park on a rainy Sunday, walking for hours under the shelter of a single large umbrella, our shoulders occasionally brushing. And before I realized what was happening, the gray, muted world I'd been tiptoeing through had started to shift. Colors seemed a little brighter. The constant background static in my head seemed a little quieter. With Arthur, I didn't feel like a broken woman trying to hide her jagged edges. I felt like someone rediscovering how to live. He had this incredible, rare ability to listen. Not just to wait for his turn to talk, not to analyze my problems or offer unsolicited solutions, but to truly hear what I was saying, and, more importantly, what I wasn't. He'd glance at me across a dinner table and somehow know, with an uncanny intuition, when I needed silence and when I needed a distraction. He never filled the air with empty, meaningless noise. Slowly, carefully, over time, I started to tell him the truth. Not all of it, not at once, but in small, hesitant offerings, like testing the water. A flicker of pain here, a vague mention of my difficult relationship with Brenda there. He never pushed for more. He just held space for me, creating a safe harbor where I could begin to unravel the tangled mess of my grief. There were nights we'd stay up late in my quiet apartment, drinking chamomile tea and listening to his old, scratchy jazz records. There were nights I cried quietly into the soft fabric of his shirt without needing to explain why, and he would just hold me, his hand rubbing my back in slow, steady, comforting circles until the storm inside me passed. And there were mornings I'd wake up on my couch, having fallen asleep there, to find a warm blanket tucked around me and a note on the coffee table telling me he'd gone to get croissants and would be right back. He learned that I liked my coffee with oat milk and the tiniest pinch of cinnamon, and he never, ever forgot. Just as things were starting to feel stable, my world tilted on its axis again. The firm I worked for, a place that had been my only refuge, announced a major restructuring due to a lost contract. My position was eliminated. I was laid off. The stability I had clung to was gone. The salary I depended on vanished. I remember sitting in my car after the meeting, holding a cardboard box with my personal belongings, feeling a wave of panic so intense it made me dizzy. That night, I told Arthur, expecting him to offer sympathy. Instead, he looked at me with a fierce belief in his eyes that I hadn't yet found in myself. "Good," he said simply. "They didn't deserve you. This is your chance to do what you've always talked about. Start your own thing. Be your own boss." The idea was terrifying. But with Arthur's steady encouragement, I did it. I used my severance package to lease a tiny office space and started my own boutique design firm. The first few months were brutal. I was working 80-hour weeks, fueled by cheap coffee and sheer terror. There were moments I was sure I would fail, that I'd have to give up and crawl back to some corporate job. Then, the unthinkable happened. I lost my biggest client, a lucrative hotel renovation project that was supposed to be my big break. The client was vague, mentioning concerns about my recent professional instability. I later found out through a sympathetic former colleague that Keith, who worked in commercial real estate development, had whispered in the developer's ear. He'd framed my layoff as me being unreliable and suggested another designer. A designer who, I discovered, was a close friend of Brenda's. It was a targeted, malicious act designed to cripple me. For a moment, it almost worked. I remember sitting on the floor of my empty office, surrounded by unpaid bills, thinking, they've won. They've taken everything. I called Arthur, my voice breaking. "I can't do this," I sobbed. "It's too much." He was there in 20 minutes. He didn't offer platitudes. He just sat on the floor with me, held my hand, and said, "Okay. So we fight back." The next day, he helped me draft a letter to the developer, not with anger, but with cool professionalism, outlining the situation. We even had a brief consultation with a lawyer to understand my options. The project didn't come back, but standing up for myself, refusing to be a victim, changed something in me. I felt a spark of my old fire return. It was in the middle of all that chaos, in the quiet moments between the struggle and the small victories, that I discovered something unexpected. Joy. Not the loud, performative joy that Brenda chased. Not the kind you post about on social media to prove how happy you are. It was the quiet, sturdy, resilient kind that nestles deep in your bones and whispers, "You're safe now. You can handle this. You're okay." I didn't tell my family about any of it. I hadn't spoken to them other than a few stilted holiday texts with my mom since the day I left. My new life, my new business, my relationship with Arthur, it all felt like a fragile, new seedling. I wasn't going to expose it to their world of drama, judgment, and sabotage. So when Arthur and I eventually decided to get married, it was just the two of us. It was a simple trip to the courthouse on a gray Tuesday morning, with two strangers we met in the waiting area serving as our witnesses. As I stood there, holding Arthur's hand, I knew with absolute certainty that I wasn't hiding. I was protecting something sacred, something real, something they no longer had the right to touch or tarnish. We didn't wear white. I wore a simple navy blue dress I'd bought on sale. There were no flowers, no long aisle to walk down, no officiant reciting recycled vows about love and honor. There was just me, Arthur, a quiet judge named Marcus with kind eyes, and our two elderly witnesses, a sweet couple named Stan and Eleanor, who smiled at us like they'd been waiting all morning for someone to ask them to believe in love again. It was raining that day. Seattle's kind of rain, soft, moody, and persistent, the kind that makes the whole world feel hushed and intimate. I remember looking at Arthur as we stood before the judge, his hand holding mine so securely, and thinking how strange it was that something this small, this quiet, could carry so much more weight and meaning than the huge, expensive party we had planned for my engagement to Keith. That had been a performance for others. This was a promise, just for us. There were no gasps, no drama, no family on either side, just two people choosing each other, plain and simple. Afterward, we walked down the block to a little French bakery we loved and split a single, perfect almond croissant. It was still warm from the oven, and flaky crumbs landed on his tie. We laughed, not because it was a perfect, storybook moment, but because it was messy and real and completely, utterly ours. Arthur never once asked me to announce our marriage. He never pushed me to call my parents or tell anyone. He understood, without me having to say a word, that some things don't need to be broadcast to be true. He just seemed to get it. He got me. Our life together became its own universe, a world away from my past. It was gentle, intentional, and mercifully separate from the one I'd left behind. We eventually bought a converted loft in an old brick building with huge, industrial windows that let in all the glorious afternoon light. I filled the shelves with my ever-growing collection of design books and somehow, against all odds, managed to keep an apartment full of plants alive and thriving. Arthur filled the walls with art from local artists he admired and supported. We hosted small, intimate dinners for our close circle of friends, people who didn't care who I used to be or what family drama I came from. They just knew me as Meredith, Arthur's wife, the woman who could talk for hours about the importance of good lighting. We took long, spontaneous road trips up the coast to the San Juan Islands, turning off our phones and breathing in the salty air without posting a single picture online. We created something unshakably, beautifully ours. And I was happy. Genuinely, deeply happy, in a way I hadn't known was possible. My business was slowly but steadily growing. I had found my footing. So when the call came from my grandfather, I almost didn't answer. It was an unknown number from an Oregon area code, and my heart did a painful little flip-flop. But something, some deep-seated love for him, made me pick up. His voice on the other end was softer than I remembered. Friendlier. "Meredith," he said, and my breath caught in my throat. He still called me Meredith. Most of my family had shortened it to Mary, a name that now felt like it belonged to a different person, but he never did. "Hi, Grandpa," I said, my voice suddenly thick with unshed tears. "Cass," he said then, switching to the childhood nickname only he had ever earned the right to use. "I'm turning 80 next month. Your grandmother is insisting on a proper dinner. I want one dinner, just the family, all together. One night. For me." I hesitated, the silence stretching between Seattle and Eugene. The thought of walking back into that house, of sitting at that table, of seeing all of them, made my stomach clench into a tight, painful knot. But he was the only one. The only one who had called on my birthday every single year after I vanished, leaving a cheerful, rambling message on my voicemail. The only one who had sent a handwritten card on my first wedding anniversary, even though no one had officially told him we were married. Somehow, he knew. He always knew. He'd sent us a small check, telling us to use it for a nice dinner out, no strings attached. No guilt trips, no questions about why he hadn't been invited to a non-existent ceremony. So I took a deep, steadying breath and said, "Yes, Grandpa. Of course. We'll be there." Arthur watched me as I hung up the phone, his expression full of a concern he barely tried to hide behind his quiet, observant eyes. He knew my entire history with my family. He simply came over, took my hand, and said, "You don't have to go, you know." "I know," I replied, squeezing his fingers back, grateful for his unwavering support. "But I think I want to." For him. Not for them. We agreed we'd go together. I wouldn't face that house, that family, alone. Not again. The drive down to Eugene a few weeks later felt longer than it should have. The farther south we drove on the I-5, the heavier the air seemed to become. Memories, both good and bad, clung to familiar highway exits and the sight of the tall Douglas firs lining the road. By the time we pulled into my parents' long, gravel driveway, the late afternoon light was already turning a deep, burnished gold, casting long, dramatic shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn. Everything looked exactly the same. It was unnerving. The old, tarnished windshield my dad had hung from the porch eaves years ago still sang its tinny, off-key song in the gentle breeze. The flower beds were a little overgrown but still thriving with my mom's beloved roses. The heavy oak front door creaked in the same familiar way it always had when my dad pulled it open to greet us. And for a dizzying, terrifying moment, I was 29 years old again, bruised and breathless, standing on that same porch, trying to find enough air to fill my lungs after watching my life come completely apart inside these very walls. But then Arthur's hand was at the small of my back, a warm, steady, grounding pressure, reminding me with that simple touch that I wasn't that woman anymore. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken words. It was polite but painfully strained. I helped my mother set the dining room table, the two of us moving in a silent, familiar rhythm from years of practice. She commented on how good I looked, how my haircut suited me, how surprised she was to see me, but she didn't ask much more. She didn't ask if I was happy. She didn't ask about my life. It was easier that way, to keep things on the surface. My father gave Arthur a firm handshake and a single, appraising nod, then returned his attention to the prime rib roasting in the oven. It was as if my 3-year absence had been a minor inconvenience, a brief interruption that was now over, something to be folded into the fabric of the family and quietly, neatly sewn shut. I was laying out the silverware, the heavy, ornate silver that only came out for special occasions like Christmas and birthdays, when I heard them. Two voices from the entryway, familiar, too familiar. Brenda and Keith. I didn't turn around. Not yet. Instead, I let them come to me. Their footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor. The sharp, confident click of Brenda's designer heels and the low, heavy thud of Keith's expensive dress shoes. I didn't have to look to know it was them. That sound had always meant the same thing: she was in control, leading the way, and he was 2 steps behind, like a well-dressed shadow she wore for convenience. When they stepped into the formal dining room, I kept my posture steady, my spine as straight as a steel rod, as I set the last heavy silver fork down on a crisp linen napkin. Then, slowly, deliberately, I turned to face them. Brenda paused mid-step, her perfectly made-up face registering a flicker of genuine surprise before she quickly masked it. Keith looked worn. That was the only word for it. Not just tired, but faded, like an old photograph left out in the sun, all the vibrant colors drained out of him. He looked a decade older than his years, with fine lines of stress etched around his eyes and mouth. Brenda, because she was Brenda, recovered first. "Well," she said, flashing that signature smirk that was all teeth and no warmth, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Look who finally decided to show up. Crawled out of your little Seattle cave, huh, Cass?" I didn't blink. I just held her gaze, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. "Nice to see you, too, Brenda." Her eyes, sharp and assessing, traveled quickly down to my left hand, which was resting on the back of a dining chair, then back up to my face. Her condescension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Still playing the lone wolf, I see, she said sweetly, just loud enough for the whole room to hear. My mom, standing by the salad bowls, froze. My dad, who was about to open a bottle of wine, paused, the corkscrew halfway in. I tilted my head slightly, letting a small, calm, genuine smile touch my lips. Actually, no, I said, my voice quiet but perfectly even. I'm married. The air in the room shifted. You could physically feel it change, the energy crackling. Even the sound of the ticking grandfather clock in the hall seemed to stop. My mother looked up from her salad, her eyes wide with shock. My father's hand paused over the wine. Brenda's carefully constructed smirk faltered, just for a second, but it was enough. I saw it. Keith's brow furrowed in what looked like genuine confusion. My husband's on his way in, I added, smoothing the non-existent wrinkles on the tablecloth. He was just parking the car. He should be here any minute. As if on cue, the front door creaked open again. We heard footsteps in the hall, the soft thud of a coat being set on the antique coat rack, and then he entered the dining room. Arthur. He wore a tailored navy coat over dark trousers, and he carried with him that quiet, unshakable authority that doesn't require an announcement. His eyes found mine immediately across the tense, silent room, and they were warm and unwavering. He smiled, a small, private smile that was meant just for me, and crossed the room as if he belonged in it more than anyone else. Sorry I'm late, he murmured, his voice a low, calming rumble. He leaned down and kissed my temple as his arm circled my waist, pulling me close and securely to his side. Traffic coming out of the city was a mess. I leaned into his solid warmth, and over his shoulder, I caught the priceless expression on my sister's face. Brenda's mouth was slightly, unattractively open, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and disbelief. Keith, meanwhile, had gone absolutely, perfectly still, his face a pale, unreadable mask. We took our seats for dinner, a carefully arranged tableau of family dysfunction. Arthur sat beside me, his hand resting lightly against mine on the white linen tablecloth, a silent, steady anchor in a churning sea of resentment. The dinner began like any other strained family gathering. Salad first, then my dad's famously delicious roasted prime rib, and the crusty dinner rolls that my grandfather insisted must come from the same local bakery they'd been using since 1982. My mother, recovering her composure, asked Arthur a series of polite, surface-level questions about his work. He was a tenured history professor at the University of Washington, and about his family, who lived back east. My father, a man of few words, mostly just nodded, chiming in only when the conversation dipped into safe, neutral territory like sports or the weather. But Brenda said almost nothing. She didn't eat much either. She just pushed the perfectly cooked food around on her plate with her fork, her movements sharp and agitated, like a child stalling bedtime. Keith barely looked up from his plate the entire time, his focus entirely on cutting his meat into unnecessarily small pieces. The tension wasn't loud or explosive. It simmered, a toxic undercurrent beneath the clinking of silverware and the forced, stilted conversation. It was there in the way Brenda's shoulders were held in a tight, rigid line. It was in the way she kept glancing between me and Arthur, her eyes narrowed with a calculating look, as if she were an engineer studying a structure, trying to locate a crack, a weakness, a flaw in our foundation. There wasn't one to find. We weren't putting on a show. We were just us. After the main course plates were cleared, my grandfather, bless his heart, slowly pushed his chair back and stood up, holding his wine glass. His hand trembled a little with age, but his voice, when he spoke, was full of a quiet, resonant grace. To family, he said, his kind eyes looking around the table, lingering on me for a moment longer than anyone else. To forgiveness, if we're brave enough to find it. And to the hope that even old, gnarled roots can bloom again. We all raised our glasses, a chorus of murmurs echoing his toast. I met his eyes across the table. He gave me a tiny, almost imperceptible wink. And then Brenda stood up. She tapped her spoon against her crystal water glass, that performative, attention-seeking little cling that she always did when the spotlight had shifted away from her for too long. "I'd like to say a few words," she announced, a saccharine, false smile plastered on her face, "about my dear, long-lost sister, Meredith." My stomach knotted into a familiar, painful ball, but I didn't look away. I just met her gaze, my expression calm and neutral. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction. Beside me, I felt Arthur's hand squeeze mine under the table, a silent message of support. "It's quite something, really," she began, her voice dripping with syrupy sweetness that failed to mask the venom beneath. "Disappearing for 3 whole years, no calls, no visits, and then just showing up out of the blue with a husband no one's ever met. It's bold. I'll give you that." I said nothing. I just let her words hang in the air. "Some of us," Brenda continued, her eyes scanning the room as if to gather allies before landing back on me, "believe in transparency. In being open with your family. But I suppose others prefer to live in secrecy. It makes you wonder what they have to hide." Her gaze narrowed, a clear, unmistakable challenge. Then, the harsh, grating sound of a chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor cut through the tension. It was Keith. He was standing up, his face pale, his knuckles white where he gripped the back of his chair. "That's enough, Brenda," he said. His voice was quiet, but it was firm and clear in a way I hadn't heard from him in years. Brenda turned toward him, her expression one of utter, stunned disbelief. She was so used to him being her silent, complicit partner. "Excuse me," she finally sputtered, her voice sharp with indignation. Keith just shook his head, a look of profound, bone-deep weariness on his face. "You don't have to do this." "Do what?" she snapped back, her voice rising, losing its polished edge. "Do what, Keith?" "Call out the fact that she showed up out of nowhere acting like she's better than everyone." I said enough. His voice, though not loud, cut through her sentence like a shard of glass. They stared at each other across the table for a long, silent moment. And in that heavy silence, it was clear to everyone in the room. Whatever had once been between them, whatever passionate, illicit, secret thing they had built on the ruins of my heart, it wasn't there now. All that was left was the heavy weight of their shared history and the bitter taste of regret. If you're still listening, if you've followed me on this journey all the way to this moment, could you do something for me? Please like this video and comment with the number 1 down below. It helps me know that you're out there, that this story is being heard. It lets me know that you're amazing, and that you're right here with me. Your support is a bigger encouragement than you could ever know. Just comment with a number 1 so I can see you. And now, let me tell you what happened next. Brenda scoffed, a short, ugly, dismissive sound that was pure, undiluted rage. She grabbed her half-full wine glass, turned on her heel with a dramatic flourish that was all her, and stormed out through the French doors leading to the dark patio and the garden beyond. Keith watched her go for a moment, his expression completely hollow, his face pale and slack. Then, like a man being led by an invisible chain, he sighed, his shoulders slumped, and he followed her out into the night. They didn't come back. The rest of the dinner was a quiet, profoundly awkward affair. My grandfather, bless his heart, ever the peacemaker, cleared his throat and immediately tried to steer the conversation to lighter topics, the weather, the state of the university's football team, anything but the bomb that had just detonated. I took a slow sip of my wine, the liquid cool and sharp in my throat, and I let myself breathe. Really, truly breathe, all the way down to the bottom of my lungs, for the first time all night. The tight, painful knot that had lived in my stomach for 3 long years, a knot I had grown so accustomed to I barely noticed it, had finally, blessedly, begun to unravel. The night ended quietly. There was no more drama. Arthur, sensing my grandfather was tired, not from the hour but from the tension, helped him back to his favorite armchair in the living room. I helped my mother clear the plates from the table, the 2 of us working in the same strained silence we had started the evening with. It was a silence thick with all the things we weren't saying, all the apologies she would never give and all the explanations I no longer needed. Before we left, as Arthur was getting our coats, my mother gave me a long, unreadable look. It wasn't angry, it wasn't sad. It was, I don't know, blank. Then she pulled me into a brief, half-hearted hug that felt more like a formality than a genuine embrace. My father muttered something about the weather turning cold and patted Arthur on the shoulder, a gesture of male solidarity that seemed to say, "Good luck, son." No one mentioned Brenda or Keith again. As we stepped outside into the cool night air, the atmosphere felt instantly, magically lighter. The air was crisp and clean, laced with the scent of damp garden soil and the faint, sweet smell of the leftover lemon pie. The single, yellow porch light cast a soft, welcoming glow across the driveway. Arthur didn't immediately move to the car. He just stood there with me for a moment, letting me take it all in. Then, he slipped his hand into mine, his warmth seeping into my cold fingers. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low and gentle. I stopped and looked up at the house, the place that held so many of my best and worst memories. It looked so familiar, so much a part of me, yet it felt so distant now, like a place from someone else's life, a set for a movie I was no longer in. Then I looked at him, at his kind, steady face in the dim light, the man who had seen me at my absolute worst, broken and cynical, and had loved me anyway. "I am," I said. And the words were the truest I had ever spoken. For the first time in a very long time, I really am. We walked the rest of the way to the car in a comfortable, easy silence. But it was the kind of silence that doesn't ache with unspoken words. It was the kind that heals. As we drove away, leaving the glowing windows of my childhood home behind us in the rearview mirror, I thought about everything I had lost and everything I had gained. The drive back to Seattle that night was different from the one 3 years prior. There were no tears, no numb silence. We put on one of Arthur's jazz albums, the music filling the car, and we talked. We talked about my grandfather, about the hollow look in Keith's eyes, about the almost pathetic rage radiating from Brenda. "She looked terrified," Arthur said quietly, his eyes on the dark highway. "Brenda? Terrified?" I scoffed. "She looked angry." "No," he said, shaking his head. "That was panic. She's had Keith under her thumb, and she's had your parents enabling her, for her entire life. Tonight, for the first time, Keith pushed back, and you weren't the broken victim she needed you to be. You were happy. You were with me. She's losing her grip, and it terrifies her." He was right. And that realization was more satisfying than any screaming match could have ever been. That dinner was a turning point. It was the closing of a door, a heavy, iron door I had been leaning against for 3 years. The months that followed were good. They were so good. My business, the one I had built from the ashes of my layoff, the one Keith and Brenda had actively tried to sabotage, began to flourish. Remember that big hotel client I'd lost, the one Keith had whispered in the developer's ear about? Well, about 2 months after that dinner, I got a phone call. It was the developer himself. "Meredith," he said, sounding awkward. "Look, I'm not going to beat around the bush. We went with the other design firm, the one Keith recommended. It's been a disaster. Their renderings are sloppy, their timelines are a joke, and they're trying to bill us for things we never agreed to." He paused. "I know I backed out on you. But I'm looking at your original proposal again, and it's brilliant. I'm calling to ask if you'd be willing to take over the project. We'll pay double your original fee to make this right." I held the phone, a slow smile spreading across my face. I looked at Arthur, who was making coffee, and mouthed, "I got it." "Mr. Harrison," I said, my voice smooth and professional, "I'd be happy to discuss the new terms." That project was the first domino. It was a massive success. It got featured in a major architecture magazine, and suddenly, my tiny boutique firm was in demand. I was hiring staff. I was flying to meetings in San Francisco and New York. I was doing the work I had always dreamed of doing, on my own terms. Arthur was my biggest champion, reading over my contracts, bringing me dinner at the office when I worked late, and always celebrating my wins, big or small. Our life was filled with quiet dinners, weekend trips to the coast, lazy Sundays reading the paper, and a deep, uncomplicated, safe love. I spoke to my grandfather every week. He had become my true north. He never spoke about my parents or my sister, and I never asked. We talked about books, about his garden, about Arthur's latest historical research. He even flew up to Seattle to visit us. I watched him and Arthur, two quiet, intelligent men from completely different generations, sit on our balcony overlooking the city, deep in conversation about World War II, and my heart felt so full I thought it might burst. This was my family now. This was my home. About a year after that fateful dinner, I got another call from my grandfather. This time, his voice was heavy. "Cass," he said, "I'm not one to gossip, but there are some things happening down here I think you have a right to know." I sat down, my stomach tightening just a little, an old reflex. "Is everything okay, Grandpa?" "I'm fine, dear. It's about Brenda and Keith." He told me that the fight we'd witnessed, the one in the garden, had been the end. Apparently, Brenda had stormed off, and Keith hadn't followed her. He had gotten in his car and left. He'd never come back. Brenda, my grandfather said with a sigh, is not doing well. She and Keith never married. He broke it off completely, told her he couldn't live with the lies anymore. I think seeing you, Cass, seeing how strong and happy you were, it broke the spell. My heart, which I expected to feel nothing, gave a strange little lurch. She's living at home, in your old room, he continued. She tried to keep up appearances, you know? Still driving the fancy car Keith had leased for her, still buying designer clothes. But there's no money, Meredith. Keith cut her off completely. The car was repossessed last week. She's in an incredible amount of credit card debt. Your mother and father are paying for her lawyers to handle the divorce, from the credit card companies, I suppose. He said it with a dry, dark humor. She's bitter, he said, his voice dropping. She's just so angry, all the time. She doesn't look like herself. She's lost that spark she always had, that electric quality. She's just dull. And mean. Your mother tiptoes around her. It's a miserable house. I was silent, absorbing this. The radiant, quick-witted girl who could steal all the attention was now 30 years old, living in her childhood bedroom, broken, bitter, invisible. And Keith? I finally asked, my voice quiet. Ah, Keith, Grandpa said. That's the real tragedy, in a way. The man is a ghost. He's a shell. That faded look you saw? It's permanent. He lost his job about 6 months ago. His firm didn't officially fire him for what he did, but the word got out. The whole messy affair. Developers talk, you know. He was seen as unreliable, bad judgment. He's been trying to get work, but no one will touch him. Last I heard, he's living in a small, sad apartment over someone's garage. He apparently called your father, drunk, a few weeks ago, just rambling, saying he'd made a terrible mistake, that he'd thrown away the only good thing he'd ever had. He meant you, Cass. He threw it all away. I closed my eyes. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel joy. I just felt a profound, empty sadness for the waste of it all. For the man he used to be, or the man I thought he was. There's one more thing, my grandfather said, his voice shifting, becoming firmer. And this is the real reason I called. I've been doing some estate planning. My will. You know your grandmother and I built that house, laid every brick of that foundation with our own hands. I know, Grandpa. It's a beautiful home. It is, he said. And it deserves to be loved. Your parents, they've made their choices. They've chosen to enable Brenda's behavior, and they've coddled her right into this mess. I'm 81 years old, Meredith, and I don't have time for foolishness. I've made a change to my will. The house. I'm leaving it to you. Outright. free and clear. The breath left my body. What? Grandpa, no, you can't. What about Mom and Dad? Your parents will have the right to live there, of course, for as long as they wish. But the deed, the ownership, will be yours. It was always supposed to be yours. Your grandmother always said you were the only one who really understood the bones of that house, the only one who loved its architecture, its spirit. And Brenda. He paused, and I heard the final, karmic judgment in his voice. Brenda will have to learn what it's like to live under her sister's roof, in a house that belongs to the woman she tried to destroy. Maybe it'll teach her something. Maybe not. Frankly, my dear, I don't care. I was speechless. The house. The house where my life shattered. The house where I'd stood barefoot on the hardwood and watched my future dissolve. The house where Brenda was currently hiding from her failures. It would be mine. When I hung up the phone, I sat in the quiet of my beautiful Seattle loft, the city lights twinkling below. Arthur came over and wordlessly wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. "What's wrong?" he murmured. "Nothing," I whispered. "Nothing's wrong." I turned in his arms and looked at his kind, steady face, the face of my real life. The news of their downfall, of my inheritance, it didn't bring me a savage, yelling joy. It brought something far more powerful. It brought a quiet, final sense of closure. The books were balanced. The universe had righted itself, not with fire and brimstone, but with the slow, meticulous, and unavoidable hand of consequence. That was my story. It wasn't easy to share, but I truly hope it reached someone out there who needed to hear it. If you have a story about finding your own freedom, about living well being the best revenge, I would be honored to read it in the comments below. Thank you so much for listening.